Hello and welcome to the Patina presentation 2020. Over 400 children will be moving on to secondary school this year from 15 schools in the Lewes area. Patina's moving on celebrations are unique to our area. The first children to do moving on are now 30 years old. Every year we have a different theme, and this year the theme is... Can I get a drum roll, please? Thank you. The theme is We're Making History, a catwalk through time. This year we'll be looking at all of the strange clothes people have worn through history. Moving on is special this year because of the virus, so we really will be making history. Today we're going to be looking at the different clothes people wore during 14 periods through history. And each school has picked one of these periods of history at random for Moving On 2020. You'll find out in a few days what period of history your school has picked out of the hat. And you can put your thinking caps on with our Patina artists to come up with some great costume designs. I think they even want to make a virtual parade with you, which sounds awesome. So while we wait to see when the Moving On parade is possible, let's have some fun with some crazy clothes. And my name's Michael, and I'm going to be your guide as we fly through a history of fashion. Now recently I've been stuck in with the lockdown, so I've been really bored. I've read all my favourite books. I started to read a book all about fashion and how to look stylish. And it kind of occurred to me, I don't look very fashionable these days, or very stylish. I always wear the same clothes. My baseball cap, my favourite old t-shirt, my blue jeans, and my trainers. And maybe it's time I should change my fashion a bit. And I started to wonder, what clothes have people worn through history? Maybe I can get a few ideas for my fashion through some historical clothing. So I sat down and I made an amazing invention. Now, before the pandemic started, I did a little bit of shopping down at the local supermarket, and I bought some essential items. In fact, I bought quite a few essential items, and I've ended up with a lot of toilet roll tubes. So I sat down and I designed and invented a toilet roll time machine. A time machine made entirely out of toilet rolls. Now this machine made out of toilet roll tubes, I built it in the garage and I put it on my front lawn and got ready to travel through time. The time machine has a very special dial that you can turn to take you back into time. There it is there, look. Turn the dial back, way through the 1960s, the Edwardians, through the Middle Ages, all the way back through the Anglo Saxons, the Bronze Age, right back to the Stone Age, the Neolithic. So join me as we explore what I think people look like through history. And watch closely, as one of these historical eras was the one picked out from a hat for your school. Okay, here we go. I've arrived back in the Stone Age, 5,000 years ago. Around that time, Lewes would have been a huge forest, a wild wood. You would have found lots of wild animals there. Red deer, beaver, wolves, and even big brown bears. Now, Stone Age people were hunters, and they wore clothes made of animal skins and animal furs to keep them warm. Now, here's a Stone Age lady. Not too sure her haircut is from the Stone Age, but there's a Stone Age lady, and she would have worn a tunic made from deer skin, trousers made from deer skin, and maybe an animal bone necklace. I'm not sure what she's carrying there. Maybe it's a Stone Age toilet roll. I'm not too sure. Now here's a typical Stone Age man. He's wearing a tunic made from animal skin and fur. He has leggings and shoes made from animal skin. And some clothes in the Stone Age were woven from plants, like these stinging nettles. I'm not too sure I'd like to wear a pair of pants made from stinging nettles, but they made clothes from plants. They used natural materials. Here comes Stone Age man down the catwalk. Okay, time to move forward through time. Here I am in the Bronze Age and Iron Age, 2,500 to 4,000 years ago. Around that time, sheep became domesticated. So most clothing was made from wool. Here's a Bronze Age man, a knitted wool cap, a wool cloak, and a leather belt, and maybe some deerskin trousers. Now, Bronze Age ladies, like this one here, would be wearing lots more wool. It could be dyed, so clothes came in a range of colours, although mostly dull colours. Maybe she'd wear a large metal plate around her belt. Moving forward through time, I'm arriving in the Roman period, 2,050 years ago. Now, Roman mosaics show us the fashions of the era. This mosaic here comes from the Bigner Roman villa near Petworth in Sussex. Roman men wore a simple short tunic. Now, women wore a palla. It was draped over the left shoulder, went round the back, under the right arm, and was held in the left hand. Important Roman men wore a toga. It was a length of cloth up to 6 meters long that was wrapped around the body. Here come the Romans down the catwalk. I've arrived in the era of Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, about 1,250 years ago. Now here's a very lovely Anglo-Saxon lady, and she would have worn long wool gowns dyed in bright colours. The gowns were fastened at the shoulder with brooches or pins. They have beautiful jewellery too, beaded bracelets and necklaces. Now around this time, there were marauding Vikings coming from northern Europe all over the coast of England. Now we always believed that Vikings had these big helmets with big horns sticking out the side. But that's not true. They've only found a few Viking helmets and none of them had horns. So Vikings dressed like other Anglo-Saxons. They wore long cloaks, shorter cloaks when riding a horse, loose tunic-like shirts with leather belts, some tight leggings perhaps, wrapped with cloth or leather, and of course, some very lovely long hair. We'll race forward through time. Here I am arriving at the Battle of Hastings. I probably arrived at a bad time to arrive, really. Now, shortly after the Battle of Hastings, they started to build Lewes Castle. But here I am in the High Middle Ages, 750 years ago. Now, before the Middle Ages, clothes had been mainly practical, but now fashions really started to take off and evolve. Men and women's clothes fitted much closer to the body, and the cut, shape, style, and decoration changed at a much faster pace. Women wore very big headdresses. These headdresses were called hennins. Men also wore hats that looked like flower pots and had very pointed shoes. But men needed something tougher than a flower pot hat when they went into battle. They needed chainmail and helmets, suits of armour, and shields. Here's some men in Lewes. They're probably heading off to the Battle of Lewes on May the 14th, 1264. And down our catwalk through time comes the High Middle Ages. Let's move forward again. Is that guy taking a selfie? Oh no, that's his cup. And there's me arriving at the back in the Tudor period, about 450 years ago. Now, poor Tudor people wore simple clothes of cheap materials like wool, linen, and sheepskin. The colours were dull and the styles were basic. In Tudor times, clothing was a sign of wealth. Men would wear a ruff around their neck and tunics covered in fine embroidery. They wear embroidered padded trunks called breeches, which were sometimes so big it was hard to sit down. And they wear long socks called hose of fine quality wool. It was the golden age of piracy. It is said that pirate Peter Love was born in Lewes. Rich women also wore elaborate ruffs around their necks and padded dresses over a frame or hoop. Henry VIII wore the most extravagant clothes of the finest silk, gold thread, and jewelled embroidery. He was known as the best dressed king in the world. I wonder if his jester was the best dressed jester too. Anne of Cleves was Henry VIII's fourth wife. Anne of Cleves' house in Lewes was part of her divorce settlement. And here, down our catwalk through time, come the Tudors. Let's move forward again. Here's Bartholomew House near Lewes Castle. It was built around 1815. We're in the Georgian period now, about 200 years ago. Now, during the Georgian period, rich women's dresses became so wide they would have to walk through a door sideways. Look at some of these incredible dresses. Rich men wore big wigs and put white powder on their faces. Lewes was a fashionable town in the Georgian era. King George IV once visited Lewes when he was the Prince Regent. It is said he rode his horse and carriage down Keir Street and survived. And coming sideways through the door, down the catwalk through time, are the Georgians. Let's move forward again. Here's Cliff High Street in the Victorian era. The Victorian era was around 150 years ago. Now, during the Victorian era, fashion became much more modest than previous eras. And men looked serious in their suits and their very tall hats. Here's a Victorian man looking very smart in his smart suit, maybe a waistcoat, a tall hat to be worn outdoors, and maybe a pocket watch on a chain. Women wore large hoop skirts called crinolines. Which were worn over a frame. At the Pells in Lewes, a new swimming pool attracted Victorian bathers. Victorian women still kept their bodies fully covered when swimming. And men wore striped one-piece bathing suits. And here come the Victorians. Let's move forward to the bottom of School Hill in the Edwardian era. About 115 years ago. During the Edwardian era, women's fashions became more extravagant. They certainly liked their big hats. The suffragettes fought for women's right to vote. Edwardian men still dressed in smart clothes of mostly dark colours. But as certain sports became very popular, Edwardian men dressed in sportswear. Golfers wore their +4s. Cricketers dressed in cricket whites. And rowers wore smart blazers. And here are the Edwardians. Let's move forward again. And here we are looking down on Lewes from the Martyrs' Monument. I'm arriving 100 years ago in the Roaring Twenties. In the 1920s, fashion moved further away from the grand uptight world of the Victorians and Edwardians. Women's styles included looser dresses that showed their arms and legs. By the late 1920s, some skirts were so short that they were almost as high as the knees. Flappers wore short skirts up to the knee and bobbed their hair and listened to jazz music. The most glamorous women in the world wore beaded dresses. Men's clothes became brighter and they wore stripes, checks and tweed. Some of the world's most famous men were the stars of the silent movies. There was Harold Lloyd, Buster Keaton, and of course Charlie Chaplin. The 1920s. Let's get back in the time machine and move forward through time. Here we are in Hamsey Crescent, and they're celebrating the end of World War II. We're 70 years ago in the 40s and 50s. When the Second World War finished, in 1945, materials and money were in short supply. People had to make, do and mend and patch up old clothes. In the 1950s, fashion and rock and roll gave teenagers the chance to let their hair down. Women wore circle dresses and bright colours, and poodle skirts were popular. Teddy boys wore colourful jackets and suede shoes, had a lot of grease in their hair. So coming down the catwalk, the 40s and 50s. Let's move forward again in the toilet roll time machine. Here we are on Cliff High Street in the 1960s. About 55 years ago. Now, in the 1960s, fashion and music was new, noisy, bright, and happy. Twiggy was a model, actress, and singer who was a fashion icon in the swinging 60s. The Beatles were fashion icons, and so were the Rolling Stones. And the Rolling Stones drummer, Charlie Watts, even bought a house in Lewes. Fashion started to become disposable. Instead of buying an expensive, well-made suit that would last a decade, fashionable people experimented with cheap clothes made with crazy fabrics and patterns that would only last for a season. Women wore mini skirts, and it was a crazy, colourful decade. And down the catwalk through time comes the 1960s. Let's move forward again. Here I am arriving in 1974 as they're building the Lewes bypass, the A27. 45 years ago, the 1970s. There were so many different styles in the 1970s. The fashion magazine Vogue said, "There are no rules in the fashion game now." Clothes were tight on top and loose on the bottom. You could have been a punk You could have been a hippie. Or you could have put on your dancing trousers and gone to the disco. And here on our catwalk, the 1970s. Back in the time machine and forward. Here I am arriving in 1987 after the huge storm. 35 years ago in the 80s. In the 1980s, everyone started wearing athletic clothes, even when they weren't doing athletics. Men wore expensive suits or shell suits. There were lots of bright colours. Women wore a lot of makeup. And so did some men. And men had some very strange hairstyles. And women's hair got bigger and bigger and bigger. And their shoulder pads got bigger and bigger too. Clothes in the 80s were about colour and fun. But a lot were made with the plastic fibres that we worry about today. In our early history, our clothes may have looked dull, but at least they didn't pollute the planet. And a final walk down the catwalk from the 80s. Okay, it's time to get back in the time machine and come back to 2020. Well, I've certainly seen a lot of fashion through time. But you know, now I think about it, the clothes I like best are the clothes I feel most comfortable in. My clothes. So I hope you've enjoyed our catwalk through time. In a few days, when everyone has had the chance to see this video, we will send you a link to your school's patina artists opening an envelope to reveal which part of history was picked out of a hat for your school. And your artist will then tell you what you will be making. We've never done moving on like this before, which makes it even more exciting. So let's make history together. And until then, have fun and stay safe.